So that's all that we have time to do with Hebrews. It's a great book, especially when you get to chapter 13. He sort of gives you the cash value of it. Starts giving you some ethical direction. Okay, this is how you should live. Let brotherly love continue. Show hospitality. Remember those in prison. Honor the marriage bed. Keep your life free of the love of money. I mean, you could write books on every one of these verses. God will never leave or forsake us, so we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? And again, all those verses, 1 through 6, when people are under stress, if they don't draw near to God, then people can be tempted to sin in ways that otherwise they wouldn't be. When things are going well and you're a religious person, then, they go well and you're religious. But if your religion isn't real, or if you're under stress, you can tend to revert to behaviors that are not godly. So I think he, just kind of goes through and lists some of the ungodly behaviors that won't be a problem if you, stay close to God. But he knows they're tempted to not stay close to God, and so he wants to help remind them of danger signs. If your marriage is slipping, if you're finding contentment in money and not in the Lord, watch out. And then other admonitions, including this observation: Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He was who he is in Old Testament times. He is who he is now, and he is who he will be when he returns. So, given his stability, let's be stable. Let's be steadfast. And I especially like the sort of alternation between obeying your leaders and submitting to them. I mean, good pastoral leaders know that submission to them is voluntary. Having said that, we all need pastoral oversight, and I include myself in that. I have people that they know a lot about my life, and we're in close connection, and they'll admonish me. They'll counsel me, and I need that. We all need that. So there is this strong note in Hebrews 13, a couple of places, about obeying your leaders, for they're keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. And then also here, Jesus suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. You're shaken because you're being reproached in your community. You're tempted to go back to what you left in order to follow Christ. Look, Christ bore reproach outside the acceptance of the norm of the people. Let's go out to Christ. If it comes to that, let's be faithful to Christ and not let peer pressure tempt us into becoming hypocrites. Acting like we're Christians, but actually buckling to pressure to convert our Christianity into churchianity. Or maybe even just bag the church. And people do that too. And then they talk about being spiritual, but not religious. I'm a spiritual person, but, I'm not that big on church and preachers and the Bible and that kind of thing. Any closing question or observation on Hebrews? Powerful book. Like incendiary. So watch out when you study it. It might change your life. And the thing is, since God is infinite, it doesn't matter how many times our lives have been changed, they still need to be changed again. So, we just enter Hebrews in a different entrance level. We probably got to think it's higher. Maybe it's actually not higher. But just because we've thrashed our way through Hebrews and learned a lot, it doesn't mean the best still isn't ahead of us in the book of Hebrews. My notes on bottom of page 3 are different. It's more of a detective game that I've got mapped out for you here. And like everything else we do, we don't have time to do it exhaustively. But what I did was sort of outline how we would go about finding what is an obvious truth to us. We assume the conclusion of this puzzle. But who is James? We're going to study the book of James. Okay, who is James? Because there are 27 mentions of somebody called Jacob, which is the Hebrew word that we translate James, although we translated Jacob. And so 27 times Jacob occurs, and it's almost always the patriarch. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Once that word refers to Joseph's father. In the Hellenistic period, when the New Testament was written, it was one of the 10 most popular names in Palestine. Like, what would be a popular name today? Gavin or Kevin or maybe James. The Hellenized form was Iakobos. And Iakobos appears 42 times in the Greek New Testament, in those 38 verses. So a few of those verses it occurs twice. So that's a lot of Jameses. And on the top of page 4, I tally those for you, which verses contain references to James. Now to break that down, most of the New Testament references are to James, the son of Zebedee. I'll give you some examples. This James was a son of thunder. Who was his brother? The Apostle John. Peter, James, and John in the sailboat. I learned a song like that in Sunday school. Fished all night, but they caught no fishes. Then came Jesus walking on the water. Okay? Peter, James, and John. Also the 3 that were on the Mount of Transfiguration. Also the 3 that came forward in the Garden of Gethsemane. So those are, Jesus' 3 closest confidants. There is that James. He was a fisherman. He was in the upper room with another apostle named James. And he was, and I think this is undoubtedly the case, he was the first apostle to be martyred. And that was in Acts 12 by Herod Agrippa, the first. There are 4 Herods in the New Testament. And this is Herod Agrippa the first. There's another disciple named James, the son of Alphaeus. He was in the upper room before Pentecost. That's all we know about him. Some of the references are to James, the son of Mary. He was not one of the 12. This was the Mary who witnessed Jesus' crucifixion in an empty tomb. Nothing else is known of him. James was the name of Judas' father. This was not Judas Iscariot, another Judas. He appears nowhere else in the New Testament. So we've got, in addition to all the Jacobs, we've got 4 Jameses there that are not the James that wrote James. There are references to a brother of Jesus. He became a pastor of the Jerusalem church. In fact, he's called a pillar. And who are the other 2 pillars? There were 3 people that Paul calls them pillars in Galatians 2, and they pastored the Jerusalem church. Peter's the second one. John. Those are the 3 pillars. And James is mentioned first, and it appears both from Scripture and from tradition outside of Scripture, that you could call James the senior pastor. So he's the senior pastor of the church at Jerusalem. He was skeptical of Jesus when Jesus was still alive, but the risen Lord appeared to him, which would make an impression on you, especially if you had sort of mocked your brother and doubted him, and become aware. Jesus became famous and infamous, and then of course was arrested and executed. That has an effect on brothers, and you just could sit and think for a long time, what would it be like to be James, who mocked your brother, and then after he died, he appears to you? What did he say? Did he have to say anything? I don't know. But something caused James, this James who wrote the book of James, to do an about-face when it came to Jesus. And so rather than be on the fence about Jesus or opposing Jesus or being indifferent to Jesus, he becomes one of his most steadfast followers. And if you read in Encountering the New Testament, which you have to because it's part of the class, then you'll be reminded of his nickname. Now he's called in the tradition James the Just or James the Righteous One. And the idea there is, he lived a really, really dedicated life to God. Does anybody read ahead? Do you remember what his nickname was? His nickname was Camel Knees. And he was called Camel Knees because, and this isn't in the New Testament, it's in a second century writer, and it's repeated by a couple writers. The idea was, as we see in Acts, for years after Jesus rose, the Christians in Jerusalem continued to go to the temple and worship. And James would go to the temple, according to this report, and he would be praying in the temple on his knees for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he prayed so much that he got calluses on his knees. And so he was called Camel Knees. I was reminded last week when I was teaching in South Africa, I was teaching with a pastor, St. Mark Lutheran Church up north of Chicago. He and I have taught together in Africa for years. And he told a story of a woman that we both knew. She died of cancer. She was in the church up there, about my age, very dedicated woman. And I hadn't heard this story, but he said after she died, he went to the house that she shared with her husband, and I guess they were having maybe an after-funeral meal or something like that. And he went in, and there were some people there, and they were there for a little while. Then the husband said to the pastor, "I want you to come here and see something." And they went to a spare bedroom, and there was the bed. On the floor next to the bed, there were 2 bare spots in the carpet. He said, "That's from her knees." And she had lived a very wild life as a young woman and rebelled. And then she came back to the Lord, and she was called Miss Susie by the little girls. She taught the 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, and she also worked with the youth. And all the girls in the youth group, they just loved her because she was such a loving person and also such a forgiving person, an understanding person, because she had been such a hellraiser when she was a kid and such a rebel. So her heart went out to these people. So I never saw her knees to notice if she had calluses or not. Plus she was on carpet. And the story with James was that he just knelt on the stone. The temple steps were, not carpet; they were stone. Plus they said, kind of like John the Baptist, he wore rough garb, rough clothes, and didn't seem to take a lot of pleasure in pleasure. He lived a rather sacrificial life because he carried this burden for Israel. And then you'll read in your book that after so many years, and of course you read Acts, you read even Paul's letters, you get the impression that the church in Jerusalem was making some progress. There was a lot of opposition, but typically when the church has a strong enough presence to be opposed, normally, whether you can see it or not, normally that church is growing. And often when the church looks like it's flourishing, actually not much is going on except stuff you can see. But when the church is being persecuted, that's often when it's really, really something is happening. And something happened through the AD 40s and the AD 50s and into the early AD 60s, which is when the Jewish rebellion against Rome happened. And there was also a civil war. The Jewish groups started fighting against each other. And right before that broke out, according to the reports, the Jewish authorities, they were getting tired of the growth of the Messianic Christians. And they knew that James was one of their ringleaders. So they arrested him. They put him up on a high wall above the temple precincts. And they said, renounce the Christ. And so he did the opposite of what they told him to do. And he said, Jesus is the Christ. And he started to preach the gospel. And that wasn't what they had in mind when they put him up there. And so they threw him off the wall. 30, 40, 50 feet, whatever it was. But the fall didn't kill him. So somebody there, according to the reports, somebody on the way to work, they were carrying their work tool. They were a launderer, what in the literature is called a fuller. And they had paddles to stir the clothes in the vat. And so he brained James with his paddle to finish off what the fall didn't accomplish. So this is the James who wrote the book of James. He also was a martyr. He was the half-brother of Jesus. He was very dedicated to obedience to God out of compassion for the lost. And these are all good things to know when you read James with his emphasis on works. He's not an armchair theologian. He knows that if you're going to follow God, that you're going to have to implement some aggressive steps in your life. You have to get up and get moving. And I don't think he disagrees with Paul at all. But I just say all that so we can help have a framework for understanding the hard-nosed nature of the book of James. I call it pushy. It's the pushiest book in the New Testament in terms of number of imperatives per verse. I think there are 68 imperatives in the book of James, and there aren't that many more than 100 verses. So almost every other verse, he's telling you to do something in the imperative mood. And not all the Bible's like that, but a lot of it is. And we'll see in our next lecture, 6 commands. 60 commands. I think a few more than that in just 5 chapters. All right, let's take our last 5 minutes, and I'll see you then.